Oh no. Hello, everyone, and welcome to From the Ground Up podcast. Thank you all so much for being here. After a very long weekend in Florida, we join you. And we have things like t shirts available on our website, as well as isopods and all that cool stuff. Maybe some substrates coming up. I'm trying to get all that stuff set up. So let me know your all's opinion on that.
Nope, y'all's.
Y'all's opinion on that.
Y'all's.
Depends on your dialect.
It's y'all's. Your all's is not correct in any dialect. But
Y'all depends who you talk to.
I mean, y'all's is correct in some. Your all's is not correct in any. So let's continue. Thank you. Just keep a lookout on our website for new things we might be popping up. Obviously on eBay also.
Dude, we have clowns. Clown isopods. They're so awesome.
I think we haven't thanked our Patreon supporters in a while.
That's true.
I think we should definitely do that. Thank you to anyone who supports us and supports this podcast and supports what we put out for you guys. We are always trying to find new and different angles, different things to talk about, different things to promote. So thank you.
I'm also gonna drop like a hefty discount code for those people who are on Patreon. As far as all of our new stuff coming out, I would like them to test it out pretty much before we make it. I don't know what the word is, available to everyone else. Other than that,
if you noticed our Instagram this weekend, we were not in Philadelphia. We took a quick weekend trip to Melrose, Florida, to Southeast Carpet Fest. And if you don't know, Carpet Fest is just a place for people who are really into snakes to not feel alone. Basically, to feel
surrounded. Retreat for those snake people who feel very alone.
Just to not feel alone, to feel surrounded by people who are interested in the same things you do. And I think Ian Bissell said it best. It's a time to get out of the computer and out of your phone and be in person with all of these people that you've talked to so much on the internet.
I want to give credit to Eric because I think he always says that describing Carpet Fest.
Oh, sorry. Ian stole it. Oops. Don't create drama.
Ooh.
Well, whoever said it, it's a great line. But
how good was the between Eric and Mike as far as Ian. Now I mess it up. Ian and Mike during the event.
It was great. Thank you to everyone who put on Southeast Carpet Fest. So Cody and Pia, Amanda and Dallas, Ian, anyone else that I'm forgetting who put it on? Justin, what am I doing? Sorry.
There's a million people, but definitely special thanks to Cody and Pia who also got us a discount in getting into the St. Augustine Alligator Farm, which was really, really awesome as well.
Yeah, it was great. We got to meet so many people and hang out with people that I never would have even thought I'd meet or anything like that. So thank you guys so much for whoever came up and talked to us, and we made some new friends.
Yeah, absolutely. And people who are friends of the podcast that we haven't met in person. And Florida's kind of a place where we haven't visited a lot before. So we got to meet a lot of new people and it was great. And all the Nido talks and stuff like that. It was really informative. And
Steven Tillis is so smart, y'all. That's definitely one thing I learned from Carpet Fest is how smart he is.
I really enjoyed Dr. Oz, which is an easy one to remember.
I know, but I always think of the TV show Dr. Oz, and I wonder
I don't know. He gets that all the time. That's why I didn't want to bring it up.
But it's impossible to separate. All the time.
But it was so crazy to see the effects of these animals that have Nido and the fact that they're not getting sick and dying. They're actually getting so much inflammation and mucus that they're actually suffocating. So it's really terrible for the animals, and it's something that obviously our hobby needs to keep a good eye on, and especially as breeders, we have a lot of animals. So it was good. It's good information to know for sure. So you are educated. Other than that, do we have anything else to add as far as Florida goes?
You talked about the alligator farm. That was great. It was great to see all the different. I mean, I've truly never been to an alligator farm. Didn't even know how many different types of alligators and crocodiles
they have. Every crocodilian.
It was pretty crazy. We got to see feeding.
Favorite one?
Cuban.
Yes, Cuban croc.
And awesome. Johnston's, but only the babies.
Yeah, so the Johnston's kind of looks like a gharial as far as it has that crazy snout. And there was one that was just sunbathing right in front of the glass with his mouth open, and we thought he was dead because he didn't move for like literally 45 minutes. And so yeah, that ended up being one of our favorite animals. But we did also shoot video of all of it, so it'll all be coming to YouTube in the next 3 to 6 months, I'm sure.
Darren asked about gators in Louisiana. Yes, there are, but it's not like if you go on a boat and
not
you see
often
them.
in uptown.
No, well, not in New Orleans, but they are in Louisiana. I've seen them before, but I've never seen like a dedicated farm, like well kept.
Well, yeah, because it's not a farm; it's really like a zoological
zoo,
facility.
right?
Yeah.
In Louisiana, I just see them in their natural area, whatever.
Yeah, and I guess farm is kind of maybe not the best vernacular to use to describe it, because it is, a zoological facility. It's not a place that breeds alligators to like sell for skins or anything like that. At least that I know
of. But yeah, okay, I think that was it.
That was it. So our guest tonight, you may know
which
him.
By the way, I still can't believe we're doing a podcast tonight. We got into Philly at 1 a.m. last night. Yes. Thank you, Spirit and Frontier, for not killing us. But now we're here doing podcasts, and we are with Dillon Perron of Animals at Home Canada.
Bam.
Maybe not
Dillon,
bam.
Thank you so much for being here. How you doing?
I'm doing great. Thank you guys very much for having me. And I have to say, to just rip an intro off the cuff is pretty impressive. That's like the most annoying thing for me. I record thousands of intros, I feel like, for each podcast and delete them and redo them. So great job on that.
That's why ours are always bad.
They're a little shaky.
They're bad.
No, it was great. It was fantastic.
Yeah, we've been doing it a lot, but
thank you.
So I guess let's do I think you have probably a pretty common story in most, see a garter snake, blah, 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 blah. So how'd you get started in this thing?
Yeah, the garter snake is definitely true. I grew up in the country, and of course, I don't think I discriminated against the type of animals that I liked. Sort of loved all animals, but definitely I have a pool in my backyard. We had a pool in my backyard, so you spent a lot of the time catching frogs in the morning that fell into the pool and whatnot. But eventually I did go and catch my garter snake, which I had for a day. And I think in Canada, it's actually illegal to catch garter snakes and keep them in captivity. So I was probably breaking the law as a 10-year-old. That's right. And I didn't have, classic, like put it in a 10-gallon aquarium, have no clue what's going on. This is like before internet was really a thing. And no lid or anything. And the next day it was gone. And I was so disappointed. I had no clue how it must have gotten out. and yeah, that's kind of, ever since then, I've always been obsessed with animals, but it took me up until I think I was about 15 until I got into the hobby. And that's when I really got my first crested gecko. Between my childhood and then I had, fish, budgies, dogs, cats, the usual. But 15 is when I first jumped into the hobby in sort of a small way. I just had the crested gecko, and that's kind of what I had for a long time.
Yeah, and how'd you hit that point where you went from one crested gecko and moved on and kind of decided to build a collection?
Well, I had this one crested gecko, and I had him for about 8 years. I still have him. He's like 15 years old. He's a great little gecko. And one of my friends also had a gecko, and she'd asked me if I could house or watch it for a few days. So they brought the terrarium over, and I watched it for I think 3 or 4 days, and then I realized how easy it was to care for 2 geckos, and how awesome it would be to have a second one. And that's sort of what got the ball rolling to sort of build up a small collection. And after that, I went and bought my own a second gecko, which was a day gecko. And then while researching day geckos, I started falling in love with snakes as well. And I had an interest in snakes before that. So it didn't take long for me to add a couple snakes to the collection. And I mean, my collection's quite small. It's only 6 animals, but that's sort of how it started to snowball in that sense.
And in the beginning, I mean, were you paying attention to your husbandry to the effect that you do today, or how did you originally set up that animal?
No, well, with the crested gecko, I did actually do plants. I don't even know why I did it, but I did do a live planted a terrarium. This basically the same terrarium that's sitting behind me now. But other than that, it was just I knew really nothing about their care. For the crested gecko, it was just mix the food and give the food every couple of days, and that was pretty much it. It wasn't until in the last few years that I've really started to dig into this a little bit more.
And I mean, with crested geckos, it seems like they're often, obviously you don't need supplemental heat and stuff like that, but also people usually just give them that powdered diet. Do you now do anything like supplementation or anything like that?
Well, I do use Arcadia's I should remember what it's called, but they have like a mineral dust that you can add to the just the powder. And so I mix that in as well for a little bit of supplements. And I do feeders once in a while, but because he basically only ate the powder for so long, he's pretty reluctant to eat anything else, which I sort of regret at this point. I wish I did have him on feeders. I think crested geckos should maybe eat more insects than crested gecko diet in some ways. And so yeah, and now I have also added UVB as well. So that's something that I'm toying with as well. But, crested gecko is such an easy animal to get into because, like you said, it's just like mix the powder and no heat, and almost anybody can start with it. So that was what got me into it.
Yeah, and I'm curious, as someone who doesn't, use a lot of that equipment, does that add heat to the enclosure, or how do you make sure that it doesn't get too hot for your crested gecko?
The UVB itself runs really cool, and my reptile room itself remains quite cool. It doesn't normally get above 75 degrees, so maybe 77, 78 in the summer, but that would be max. So I never have any issues with temperature. And so the warmest I'll see his enclosure in the summer would be 80, 81 degrees. But of course, there's quite a large gradient as well. So I never really have to worry about that.
And kind of where did you go from that crested gecko, the day gecko? Do you still work with those?
Yeah, I still have the original day gecko as well. So I got her, and like I said, so I actually made her a planted vivarium as well. I converted a china cabinet into an enclosure, which was just a massive project, and I wouldn't recommend it. It's almost too much work for what it's worth. And then I got into my boa. So the first boa I bought was just a Central American sort of Sonoran. Actually, he's 50% Sonoran desert boa and 50% Colombian boa, and he was just in a tub, like just a regular tub, paper towel. That's how I started as well, and slowly started to kind of learn along the way.
Yeah, I guess there's kind of definitely a transition from lizards to snakes. I mean, especially it seems like the standards are set a bit lower for snakes. But
yeah, it in a way it is. It's there's certain, like dart frogs, for example, have that high level of care right from the get-go. Like nobody's going to keep a dart frog in just a plain sterile environment. And so every animal almost has its foundation where you can start with. And yeah, geckos tend to have a little bit higher than snakes. And I actually had no interest in snakes whatsoever until for some reason, it's hard to say what turns you on to a certain species, but for some reason I just fell in love with these boas, and part of the appeal initially is that ease of care, that sort of tub, paper towel, water dish, and I was really excited about that. That was great. It was going to be a very easy animal to care for,
And I mean, at that time though, did you already kind of have a grasp on how to keep temperatures and humidity from your day gecko, or were you just kind of getting used to that?
Well, yeah, in terms of the care, like I had a decent grasp on husbandry. Luckily snakes are, like you said, quite easy. And so I didn't have to struggle too hard to learn how to care for the boa, because it was fairly easy. Once I set the tub up and the humidities were balanced quite easily. And so it was more of, once you learn how to take care of one species, I feel like you can easily copy and paste sort of the archetype of learning how to care for an animal.
100%. Oh, I thought you touched my leg to ask a question.
No, I touched your leg to stop popping your beer can. Great. Nothing to do with podcast.
I have to edit that out too.
Hey, I didn't hear it.
So what made you make that transition from, being pretty minimalistic to kind of your more modern philosophy that you have at the moment?
Well, so I had these three animals at the time: the crested gecko, the day gecko, and the boa. And I was just starting to become obsessed with the hobby. And that was the time where I'm just like every day looking at the local classifieds, looking for new animals and seeing different, boas and ball pythons and whatnot for sale all the time. And, I eventually stumbled upon another boa that was essentially in almost like a rescue situation. This was somebody who was trying to sell it for a couple $100s, and this animal was in horrible shape, stuck shed all over the place, no external heat. This person actually called me an idiot for suggesting that snakes needed heat, and it was really
wow.
Yeah. So somehow I got her to basically give me the animal. I said, look, no one is going to pay for this. This animal's essentially on a deathbed. It wasn't that close to dying, but it was on the path to death if it had left in those conditions. And it was in like a 24 by 18 by 18 Exoterra, which it was a small boa. It was I think she was around 100 grams when I got her. So it's not an ideal enclosure for a boa. You could make it work, but she wasn't utilizing the vertical space or anything like that. And so I went and picked up this animal, and she basically gave it to me for free, thankfully. And when she gave it to me, the thing she said is, "I'm not going to give you the enclosure because I want to get a bearded dragon next." And I thought, okay, so these little things were starting to stick in my head, and I thought that was kind of weird. This person really had no idea how to take care of this snake, and now she's going to get into a different animal, and she clearly has no idea how to care for that. So that was just, stuck in my head. But when I got home, I was so excited about this new boa, and I eventually figured out where she was from, and she was het albino, and my other one is het leopard. So I start going down the morph thing, because I actually enjoy. Despite what people might think is, and even though I've said it, I do find morphs quite fascinating, and I have these two animals, even though it makes no sense to breed those two animals to create anything. But for some reason, I was so excited, making your Punnett squares and whatnot. And I'm going 10 years out, this giant breeding plan. But then what I started noticing, this is maybe more specific to my area because I do live in a fairly small community. And I mean, we have one reptile expo a year, and there might be 8 vendors type thing. So it's not a huge reptile community. And I kept seeing the same animals for sale. There's specifically this one litter of boas for sale online that I think it was like 8 to 10 months. This person continuously trying to move this litter of boas, and she kept dropping the price, and nobody's buying them. So that started to seem interesting to me. And then I actually traced this rescued boa back to that litter as well. So what it made me realize is that I cannot add more animals to this market. This market is so saturated that even the animals that are being produced are not ending up in the right homes. So that was what initially planted the seed for me to start thinking just a little bit more ethically, just in my area. Because if I breed boas, now I have, say 20 boas, 20 baby boas, they're going to live for 20, 30 years. That's like 400 to 600 years, boa years. It's like, do I want to be responsible for that? That's a huge commitment, unless I'm willing to care for all of them, So that was kind of what initially started it. But I didn't, at the time I wasn't on YouTube, I didn't have a podcast or anything. So then I just decided that I would just enjoy the animals. And even then my care wasn't anything more than, a tub really, with maybe a little bit more height, but no extra lighting or anything. I think I had maybe aspen substrate, but that was the beginning of what allowed me to kind of go down this path.
Yeah.
I think it's interesting that you kind of like stopped yourself. I think a lot of people, it's hard. We always balance like how much weight do we put on ourselves for that animal once it's out of our hands. And I think a lot of people don't allow themselves to think about that at all. And so then they do end up saturating the market or doing whatever, because they're just like, I want to breed this. I want to breed. I want to feel like, see what it's like.
You also need to detach yourself from the outcomes, unfortunately, sometimes to justify you doing it, because there's such a large majority, and I kind of say majority, that don't go to the right place and don't fulfill, have a full life. I mean, the one thing that happens with those $2,500 ball pythons, at least they're being kept decent enough, for a decent amount of time until they're super cheap. But, even for us, when we sell corn snakes, I would say about 50%, just like your garter snake, will get out. And, we're trying to think like, how do we mitigate these things? How do we control these things? And at the end of the day, it's like, as a breeder, you can do all you want, but you don't have control over the outcomes of these animals.
Yeah, it's so right. And for me, like I said, I think because of the area that I live in, it was basically by watching the online ads, it was very evident that the most likely case was that I was just not even going to be able to sell them, even to sell them to bad homes, which is sort of heartbreaking in some ways as well. But at the same time, I was like, I can't afford to care for 20 animals. Like, what if I have to do this forever? And so that's what made me stop. But I can tell you, I wanted to breed really badly, because it is an exciting part of the hobby. And I felt like I was ready to advance myself and try something new. And like I said, the genetics of the morphs sort of adds an interesting aspect to it. And I can totally see the appeal. it was just, I had to make that call. It's what will I do with these animals and where are they going to end up? And that's what initially pulled me back.
I mean, now you have a podcast, you have Instagram, you have a website and you participate in so many things across the hobby as far as husbandry goes. I mean, now you could have a clutch and find great homes for 10 to 15, however many animals you produce. Does that make you feel different about it?
Well, I would never write off the potential of breeding in the future, because I do want to try it. And I think it's exciting. And I mean, right now, the place that I'm living in really does not warrant the space for it. But when I do have a bigger space, and like you said, like I would probably be able to sell them to really good homes and whatnot. So I would definitely do that in the future, provided that I have the space. And that was one of the, like you guys kind of had mentioned, it's really tough as a breeder to ensure that the person buying the animal knows what they're doing. It's like, how much support can you provide every single person you sell? So that's another, I'm sure, I don't know if you guys run into that at all, but I'm sure you're open to have as many questions as the buyers have. But at some point, like, you don't have enough time in the day to answer questions.
It's so hard. It's one, like, how much do you answer questions and how much do you like put your heart into answering those questions, if that makes sense. Like, I'm a person,
enough.
Right. Well, I'm a person, like, I'm emotional. Like, I feel this need to do things that I probably don't have to, but like, especially with customers, I'm like, oh, I need to like give them everything and anything,
And listen, like 90% of the time, they're not even our customers. They're random people on Instagram too, which makes it even weirder, because you have taken this responsibility randomly because you have like an Instagram page. So I'm feeling this responsibility for something that I had zero involvement in. And I mean, that's a lot to ask for, it feels very random, but.
Yeah. I mean, that is one of the issues for sure. It doesn't matter what side of the spectrum you sit on, is that there's a lot of people that buy the animals that seemingly have no intention in learning how to care for them. And that's for sure an issue. And then hopefully as we evolve, that will become maybe solved in some way. But I mean, pet stores, how many animals do they sell? They send them home with people that really have no clue what they're doing. And I'm not saying pet stores shouldn't sell them, but it's sort of an interesting issue that we have to jump over.
And how much of that responsibility lies on the pet store,
right?
Or
See,
the breeder?
It's the same thing. And theirs is
seller.
Even worse than us. Like, we're just, they're selling 10 times what we're selling. And like, is that their responsibility?
Because a lot of breeders would say, go do your research and come back to me, type of thing.
But a pet store can't say that.
Work. That never really works, because that person's just going to go get the $25 corn snake off the other table of the guy who does not care. So at the end of the day, you're still kind of not serving the animals, whether it's your animal or someone else's animal.
Yeah, making the sale is a big part of it. Obviously, running a giant corporate business like that, and it does get tough. And that is sort of one of the reasons that I started drifting towards providing more enrichment, or just so the people that are outside of the hobby, when they look at it, they don't see a plain tub with a water dish and think, I can easily do that. Obviously, I trust breeders in order to care for animals in a racking system and make sure their animals are healthy. But random dude off the street that sees a tub with a paper towel and a water dish, it seems like it may be too easy to their naked eye, and they're jumping into something that they're not willing to commit to learning about.
You can easily get 20 animals in your first month of of having them.
Totally. Yeah. That's the other thing. It does expand. Yeah, exactly. It expands so easily, and it's so fun to buy new animals. That was the other thing I became aware of, is like, when you buy a new animal, that excitement that you get, like a dopamine hit, and it's great to have that. But at the same time, you want to make sure that you're not sacrificing the other ones in your care to make another room for another animal, and so on and so on.
I think also what we see in corn snakes is that people take that mentality, the sterile mentality, and honestly, corn snakes and king snakes, some of the North American colubrids, benefit so much from having just substrate to burrow in. So it's like, even as a commercial breeder, even with someone with hundreds of animals, we still do, 3 inches of like the basics, like the 3 inches of substrate and that kind of thing, and hides and stuff like that. And it's like, people aren't even doing that without regard to the species. I mean, you're not even thinking about the actual species you're keeping.
So I'm thinking, sorry.
Well, yeah, it's that's very true, and it does. The sort of sterile setup does separate you from the wild counterpart of the animal. So when you see a corn snake in a plain tub without substrate, you actually, if you're not familiar with the species natively, if that makes sense, you actually can't picture what that animal looks like in the wild, or what its habitat looks like. So it's tough to understand how it should be behaving. It's like, well, reptiles are so tough, they can live through almost anything. And so it can be easy to trick ourselves into thinking that we're doing a great job, but they just keep plugging away with very minimum requirements.
Yeah, I think for a very long time, our standard was if it breeds, that means we're keeping it right.
Yeah.
Do you think as people, who are putting information out there, we're in the spotlight, being on social media and everything, like, should we, put our things like one step above what is expected? Because should we expect that people are going to do one step below what we present? Like, is that how should we think about it?
Put something up and then people will put it down for other reasons
should we, is that how we should be thinking about it? Like, we need to go, like, say 5 steps past what we would want other people to do. Is that, I don't know. I don't want to think bad of people or less of people, but is that just is that what we should expect? Like, they're going to do less than what we're putting out there, so we should put out more. Does that make sense?
Well, it definitely makes sense. And that is kind of the line you have to walk. Like, you don't want to say to somebody, you must start with a bioactive enclosure. But I like to go back to dart frogs because they're such an interesting species, because every dart frog enclosure you see is essentially bioactive. And it's almost how you have to keep them, or they'll die because they're quite sensitive. So people see that and they go, that is how you care for a dart frog. There's very little continuum in terms of the range of how you can care for them. But at the same time, if you're not a slightly more advanced hobbyist, jumping into something that's too advanced will kill your animal. Like, you're going to give an RI if you try to do a bioactive ball python enclosure and have no clue how to balance heat and humidity, for example. So it's a good question. Actually, it's something to think about for sure.
Yeah, and I feel like sometimes naturalistic or live plant or bioactive, I mean, we're actually adding too much complexity to it. Maybe just like the basic, you start with the basic setup, the aspen, the hide,
but
the
see, then I think people are going to go, it's so weird. What's that medium, like, not as far as bioactive, but like, if we just give, I feel like with corn, since they're such beginner pets, we've kind of gotten used to being like, these are the 3 things you need. This is all you need, substrate, hide, whatever. Like, this is all you need. But if we're presenting that to people, like, we're giving them that ability to, like, go lower than that. Should we be saying, no, these 6 things? I don't know.
I feel like we need to give them examples of how to bring their husbandry to the next level once they get the hang of it or something like that.
Yeah, and it's almost, instead of saying this is all you need, it's almost better to say this is how you start. This is actually how you can start caring for your corn snake. And you can do this for 5-6 months. Once you feel comfortable, try adding something different. Try advanced. So that's what my biggest thing is. One, I'm not an expert. I don't know anything. And the second thing is I just promote growth. So if you're here, how can you slowly advance your care? Do not jump into something you're not comfortable with. But if you want to start with a plain tub, no problem. Make sure your snake is eating, pooping, growing. Now, maybe in 6 months, let's add some substrate and then watch the animal. How does it behave? Does it seem stressed, or is it using that substrate to burrow? Then that it's almost like a positive feedback loop in a lot of ways for keepers, because they start to see their animals do different things. And that's pretty exciting for reptile keepers, because so often they're not doing anything.
And what were kind of your first steps with your boa? What are kind of the steps you took?
Well, the first thing for sure was adding some substrate and adding just climbing branches in general. So allowing them to climb was huge. And especially when they were younger, they still climb a lot, which I love to see. And size was a big one. Going to a 6-foot long enclosure, allowing them to way more space, and even water dish big enough for them to soak in, things like that. A lot of these are pretty basic, and a lot of people are already doing them, but a lot of people aren't. And some animals aren't going to use a thing to soak in, but the only way to find out if your animal is going to is to put it in and see what happens,
Yeah, absolutely. And Melissa, you see us behind our beautiful wooden wall.
Yeah, it's a little flexible.
I don't know. Our cabin's not built very well, but Yeah, and what do you I mean, a BCI, I mean, they get, you know, maybe you're looking 5 to 7 feet if you feed them well. So I mean, that's a very sizable enclosure.
Yeah, and right now they're both fairly small still. I've been feeding them pretty slowly. The male that I have is basically a Central American boa. He's going to be maxed out at 5 feet, and the other one I don't know what she is because it came from these breeders that are mixing different bloodlines and whatnot. But I could expect her to get to maybe 7 feet, and eventually I will put her in an 8-foot enclosure when it's necessary, and with height as well, because I enjoy watching them climb. And then the latest thing I recently did was add UV to their both enclosures as well, as sort of an added piece of enrichment.
So what is your going forward? I mean, what are you looking for as far as enclosure size?
Well, I'm definitely eventually with the female boa, I would like to move up to an 8-foot enclosure. Once she's at that sort of 6 foot plus, I'd like to get that. And these enclosures are actually on their way out soon. I have some new ones coming in a couple months that I'm going to work on. But and then they're going to have some more height as well. They're about 2 feet tall, and we're going to go to 3 feet tall, I think. And like I said, it's almost time for a house because they need more space.
And I know that kind of we're starting or want to get the standard of at least the body length of the animal. It seems like you're going a little bit bigger. Is there any like distinct ratio you're looking for as far as the length?
Not really. No, I definitely I've wanted to just go longer than the body at some point, just maybe even a few inches to start with, and kind of go from there. Like I said, both of them are fairly small still, which is kind of nice. But yeah, I think the length of the body is a great place to start, because I mean, I don't know, I kind of forget now what the standard was before, but it was almost like, was it 3/4 of the length?
Well, yeah, it was 3/4 of the body length, typically on like especially colubrids and stuff like that, which I don't know.
Yeah, and so that's where you start to question with some of these things are more breeding industrial standards rather than care standards, and then you start running into people that will make claims that they can't thrive in larger enclosures, which can be true depending on how you set it up. So we kind of have two worlds: this industrial breeding side as well as the care side of someone that's never going to breed their animal. It's actually okay if they have an enclosure that's more than 3/4 of the body length,
I think that especially for something like a boa or a corn snake, I think that they benefit from as much space as you can give them. None of them will go off feed. That's only for ball pythons, or mostly for ball pythons, I say, that people see that, and they apply it to every other animal.
Yes, yeah. There's a lot of ball python myths that carry into other things, and when I'm looking at my snakes, so obviously a lot of times they're in their hides sleeping, and at that point you're like, oh man, these enclosures are huge. But as soon as you see them motoring around and exploring, you start to think, wow, I definitely could use some more space. Like I feel like he would climb 8 feet if he had 8 feet of space.
Oh, absolutely. And we even have a customer, he has like cameras on his corn snake at all time.
Oh, cool.
And this thing's like 8 inches, and the enclosure is like huge, and you see it literally from top to bottom. It will explore at a very particular time from like 10 to 12 at night, explore every inch of that enclosure. And that also comes to say, or goes to say, as far as my snake doesn't move all day. Well, it moves when you don't see it.
Mm-hmm.
It doesn't want to move in front of you.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, exactly. People are like, my snake's not drinking water. It's like, well, have you looked at it for 24/7 for 5 days straight?
Yeah, and as far as we did cage size, but what else are you doing? You also mentioned things like UVB.
Yeah, so with my boas, I've added UVB, and eventually, like I said, these enclosures are going to be gone. I'm going to get something with an open mesh top, not necessarily a screen, but because I really want to add halogen lighting as well, to add some more, further the spectrum of the infrared wavelengths, which is just something that I'm just learning now. And it's something that I did with my day gecko. So she has full spectrum light. That's why it just looks like a white dot on the screen, because this enclosure is so bright. And I have the Arcadia, the Jungle Dawn LED bar, which provides full spectrum light. And of course I have a UVB bar, or a UVB tube as well. But then also her basking light, instead of just a conventional, I mean, there's so many different ways to heat, but the halogen bulbs produce a really nice spectrum of wavelength into the infrared wavelength, where heat mats and radiant heat panels and whatnot are really on the far, so you can break the infrared wavelengths down to 3: infrared A, infrared B, and infrared C. And infrared A and infrared B are the wavelengths that we get mostly from the sun, and those are the healthy wavelengths that penetrate very deep into tissue, where infrared C tends to stop at the skin, and it'll warm the skin, but it doesn't penetrate very deep. And with my boas, I have heat mats and a radiant heat panel and whatnot, and I really want to move away from that as soon as I can to just provide something more natural in terms of their light.
So what bulb is it exactly that provides all of that? I mean, are you using something that provides both heat and UV?
No. So for my day gecko, I just have an Arcadia 12% UVB bulb, and then the halogen is literally just like a flood halogen from the department store. It's just Home Depot. Find a halogen that's I think it's just a 50-watt bulb, because they do get pretty hot, and it's just connected to a dimmer, and I just sort of balance the temperatures and use a laser temperature gun just to get the basking spot to the right temperature. And that's all I've done there, which is actually fairly cheap considering how expensive some reptile products can be. And it's just healthier as far as I've been, read and been told on the podcast and whatnot.
And now, I mean, is that something that you run only during the day? Is there some type of light cycle that you like to stick with?
Yeah. So with the day gecko, obviously it's just on during the day. It's just a 12-hour, 12 on, 12 off. And one of the other things I did with the day gecko, which is fun and potentially totally pointless, and kind of expensive, and I don't necessarily recommend doing it, but it is fun. So I have a Philips Hue smart bulb on her enclosure as well. And before her lights turn on, that bulb will click on. And once all the lights turn off, that bulb is the only one remaining. And then it will slowly dim off for about 30 minutes. So it sort of simulates a sunset. And in the morning, it does the opposite. That's the first bulb to come on at like 10%, and it slowly ramps up. And then once it's at its full brightness, then the rest of the lights come on. And I think that's just for me because it's fun. But also, I wonder how stressful it is to get blasted by the amount of light that's coming out of that enclosure in one shot. So it's just different fun things that trying to simulate somewhat of a natural world. And if I do end up getting halogens with the boas, of course, I'm not going to leave those on during the day or during the night, because that will sort of mess up the light cycle. I'm starting to wonder how much heat needs to be provided at night. Or maybe I just use a heat mat, but I think there's a lot of people suggesting that maybe night heat is not as necessary as we once thought. So once I get down to that road, I'll kind of figure out what I'm doing there.
So what's the balance, to take between modern keeping techniques and also trying to mimic nature? Because obviously we can only do so much in a box in our room.
Yeah, well, that's the thing so I think it's one of the critiques I sometimes get is that it's not mimicking nature, because nature is a lot more harsh than what we're providing. And that is 100% true. I'm not introducing parasites and predators and, lack of food and whatnot. Although some of those things are, not parasites and predators, but lack of food is sometimes, I think, okay, considering I think the hobby tends to feed animals a little bit too much. But so it is important that you can strike a balance, but the balance happens on your ability to care for the animal safely. That's where you want to sit. You don't want to sit beyond. You don't want to be at that part where you think if you're going to be away for a weekend, is something going to happen to the enclosure that I can't manage away from here? So you don't want to step so far out into that natural world that you cannot care for the animal safely.
I guess that also brings an extra level of complexity. The fact that with our collection kept simply with snakes, with just heat, we can pretty safely just go away for a few days and not have to worry. Are there ways to automate what you have going on? I was about to ask
also, are they connected to your phone, or why? I know they have all those special technical things.
Yeah, I don't have anything crazy. And again, I'm not this gold standard for bioactive care. So I think there are people out there that do have maybe slightly more level of automation. I do have a misting system that comes on and off a couple times a day for the day gecko. But for the most part, it is on, off, heat, just like your lighting or your heat would be with your snakes. It's not a huge difference there. But the other side to think of is I only have 6 animals. So I don't have a collection of 30 animals that's a full-time job for me to care for. And that is by design, because I started to realize that if I want to care for them in the way that I think I can, then I need to put a number on this. Put a stop before I get to the point where it's impossible financially and time-wise.
Yeah. Snakes are expensive, y'all.
Yeah, I think that's the appeal to breeding, though, is somewhat the fact that you can kind of, I put in quotes,
Make
make your money
back.
back on how you keep.
Well, yes, and
Or breeding most.
that was, I mean, I don't know what your guys' experience is, but you do have, another moment I had before I got into the podcast with somebody that made me question some of the motives in the hobby. And again, I have to say carefully, this is not directed at all breeders, because of course I'm a fan of breeders and I would love to breed myself one day. But this random lady in a convenience store had a ball python around her neck, and which was already bizarre enough. And so I kind of asking her about it, and she said, yeah, this is a ball python. It was a totally normal looking ball python. But then she said, he's got a bunch of really crazy genetics, and my friend also has one, and we're going to breed them and make a whole bunch of money. I thought, okay, that's interesting, because and I didn't say anything, but it sort of stayed in my head, because business is very difficult. As you guys know, it's a hustle for one. It's extremely stressful, and actually creating your own cash flow is not that easy. But a lot of the times, snake breeding businesses are depicted as turnkey businesses. Buy a female, get a couple males, or a couple females and a couple males, and you will be making money in a year. And I always think, no, that's actually not pretty much completely unlikely. I'm not saying breeders don't make money. Eventually you do, and some good breeders make good money, I'm sure. But when your product eats and poops and dies and has to be sold, that's actually more challenging than like a conventional business. Like maybe, like, I don't know, any simple business. Breeding snakes is almost one level more challenging.
Yeah, because your stock could die at any. In other business, you buy stock and you're able to sell it. Here, you have to make sure it lives, make sure it eats. If it gets sick, you need to take care of it. Like, your stock shouldn't just disappear overnight. Your whole collection can get disease, virus, all this stuff can go through, and you can lose, half of your collection in a year or something. Like, it's not as easy as people make it seem.
Exactly. And that was always my sense, that people get into it because they want to make money initially. And it's actually very challenging to make money. Now, if you're breeding because you love it and you enjoy it and you can find a great ethical place for these animals to go, that's awesome. And if you are making a little bit of money, that's great as well. But one of my pet peeves in the industry is painting breeding as a good source of generating a second income. It can be. That's 100% true, for sure.
Or even quit your job. I mean, that's a thing now. It's like everyone's aspiration is to be a full-time breeder.
Yeah.
I think you need to go see the full-time breeders and see how big their collections actually are and how many animals they actually produce and the marketing they're doing and the sales and how high touch it is. I mean, it's crazy.
And go to the bank and explain to them your business model and watch them point the door and say, get the hell out of here. This is not a business. This is not a business that someone would invest in. Now, again, fantastic that people invest their own money into this, and that's great. But to paint it as a turnkey business, it's just not. And I think it's one of the, you see so many sad stories of people taking their collections to other bigger breeders and be like, I can't do this anymore, and I've invested $15,000 and I'm in the hole.
Their house. Yeah. People have gone to great lengths.
Yeah, and that is a sad, and that doesn't even account for the animals that they may have produced and just tried to sell off just to keep themselves afloat, to selling off to who knows who, just to get some cash flow.
I'm sounding very anti-breeder right now, so
no, we're just being. I think it's being realistic, because it's funny, because I don't think any big time breeder says it's easy. So I'm not sure where these people are getting.
It's those people in the middle, those people who are trying to make it themselves, and they sell the dream. It's like,
who's saying it's easy? Who's doing that?
I won't.
We'll talk about this after. I don't know anyone who's saying it's easy. I haven't met anyone who's saying it's easy.
Because we know.
Yeah, well, I don't know who says that. But it is one of those memes that you see in the industry where people kind of have that assumption, or a false assumption in some ways. And I don't want to come off as anti-breeder as well, because there's some really fantastic breeders out there. But it's sort of my point is that it's not the only progression to make in the hobby. And that's where I initially thought, said if I feel comfortable caring for these animals, then breeding must be the next step, because I'm kind of bored with what I'm doing. I want to do something more challenging. and we can talk about that in a little bit, because I do think the challenge of the hobby is an incredibly important aspect of it. But just opening up, that increasing the level of your care or your enrichment can also be extremely gratifying as well. And you don't have to bring along the baggage of what breeding can bring along.
Yeah, I think that, I mean, recently or over the last couple of years, I've started building out some enclosures and stuff like that. And I found I kind of get that same enjoyment out of doing that just as much as I do as producing the animals. So it's like, maybe we can strike a balance between this somewhere.
Definitely. And the easy way to tell when you're engaged in something is when the day flies by really fast. So whether that's, creating your breeding program to create the next morph, or, to create your next offspring, or building an enclosure, or doing research, like we've all been there when 4 hours go by and you haven't eaten, you haven't looked at your phone, and you're just enjoying being in the hobby. And it's actually super important that people are doing that, and not just reaching to like, I'm going to get a new animal because that makes you feel good. There are other things you can do that are super gratifying in the industry.
And I think that's a good thing to talk about because, I mean, especially, someone like you, maybe you have under 10 animals. How do you not get bored, basically? Because I feel like the solution to boredom is buy a new animal.
But yeah, you found ways.
Yeah, well, I think I'm going to say this, and I don't want to come off as this genius that found this on my own. A lot of it was because I didn't have the money to get more animals. I didn't have the space to get more animals. So it was like, yeah, how am I going to not get bored? Because there are certainly times where you're just like, I don't hate my snake, but I would love a different snake. You find yourself looking at different snakes and whatnot. But the thing, progressing your care and finding new ways to enrich them, there's no top to that. You can continuously do that, and that's what's exciting. And I mean, when I had a conversation with John Courtney Smith, I forget exactly the quote, but it was something along the lines of the amount of enjoyment that you get from even if caring for one animal and continuously progressing the care can be massive. And I do truly believe that, and I'm slowly finding that myself. I'm nowhere near where I want to be with my care, and I don't come off as this gold standard, and I don't make videos saying this is how you care for things, because I don't feel that way myself. But I'm just trying to grow and enjoying the process of growing.
Yeah, and that's also a good point to where it's like, it's hard to make like a care video, or you see people make care videos when they just did the unboxing, and it's like, you haven't really cared for the animal enough to know that. But
yeah.
And also, like, there's so many different ways, and in Manitoba, I bet you it's much different to keep reptiles than someone in Florida. So there's also like geographical, I feel like, considerations to take in.
Oh, definitely. I mean, I have this massive spectrum of humidity I have to deal with just in my apartment. Like in the winter, the relative humidity goes to 6%. And in the summer, it goes to 60%. So I have this challenge with my enclosures: is how do I maintain humidity in the winter, but ventilate in the summer type thing. So yeah, exactly right. There is always difference depending on where you are. And actually, this was the quote that John had said, that you can get just as much enjoyment in collecting information about the animals, natural habitat, where they live, read some papers, read some books, look at pictures, than you can at collecting individual animals themselves. And I have actually found that to be true. You could spend hours reading about day geckos, giant day gecko, where do they live? Show me pictures. There's tons of pictures on iNaturalist of natural or of wild geckos in their natural habitat. That's really fascinating. And I actually think most people involved in the hobby would find that fascinating, because we're all here because we love the animals and we think they're truly amazing.
And honestly, I think any good breeder does that. If you go to any good breeder and start to talk to them about their animals, they know like the natural history of the animal. They could talk at lengths about the natural history because they go into, they read books about it. They do all this research that is unnecessary, doesn't even pertain to keeping the animal in captivity. But it's just that base of knowledge that makes you seem more legitimate. So that doesn't just apply to someone who's trying to keep it exciting for themselves. I mean, it's also a benefit if you're someone who's looking to sell those animals in the future, because the more you get out the story about the animal, the more people are going to be interested in it, and the more people are going to care for them efficiently.
Oh, totally. Yeah, you can sell the story. That's exactly, like, that's a really, really good way to put it. Selling the story of the animal in the wild is very crucial. And that was one of the things that I kind of came to myself, was realizing how much I love the animals and trying to figure out a way that one of the things that I do with animals at home is I make donations to the Amazon Rainforest Conservancy, which is a Canadian charity that protects parts of the Peruvian rainforest, Amazon rainforest. And for me, it was actually important to see if I could leverage some of that interest in the captive animals and help the wild populations as well. And part of that is appreciating what they must be like in their native habitats. And that's what I attempt to do with my own animals.
And did you stumble upon the Amazon conservation because of your love of boa constrictors?
Yeah. So I also have a rainbow boa as well, and I have these boas, and I just thought that was fitting, and it was a Canadian charity. And at this time, I wasn't fully, I would say, fleshed out on my foundation of my ethics and my philosophy, and I'm still not. That will always continue to grow. But at the time, the podcast wasn't even started. Animals at Home was basically just a YouTube channel and a blog, and I would write some sort of care things, and it kind of felt weird, like I was trying to make these videos but then I stumbled across, wanting to help a charity as well. And the first thing they said to me was go away, basically. Which also was one of those things where I go, that's weird. And the reason they said go away is because they didn't like the way the reptile hobby was perceived to them. They saw it as a horrible thing that took animals out of the wild and took advantage of them. And of course that's not true, but that was how other people outside the hobby were viewing us. And I actually had to really convince them otherwise and say, basically, if I didn't have my own rainbow boa, I would not be interested in donating to a charity that would save rainbow boas, And eventually they said yes, and we have a good relationship now. But that was kind of the reason that I went down that path.
And do you think that there is kind of a rift between, say, conservationists? I mean, obviously between conservationists and pet keepers, but also like biologists, zoo field, all that stuff?
There definitely is. The rift is that the keepers almost feel threatened a lot of times by the biologists, because the biologists are out there studying the native animals in their natural environment. And it's almost like, in some sense, we're worried that they're going to discover something that's going to make it impossible for us to care for them in captivity. And then the biologists, on the flip side, really a lot of the times would rather us not keep the animals captive, because they see them in their wild habitat and then they see them in captivity, and there's a huge disparity between those two beings, and they don't like it. But it's important to know that the hobby can be so important for the scientific side, and vice versa as well. A lot of people in biology got into biology because of an interaction they had with a captive animal as a child. And it can kind of become a positive feedback loop in a sense. It's super important, but it is also important to talk about that rift, because it is there, and it's important that we're communicating with both sides.
And I think that there's kind of this, I don't know, there's kind of a mentality that kind of makes a little bit of sense of the fact that, we are kind of the door, or like the first step to getting these people interested in reptiles, especially at reptile shows. We've convinced parents to pick up snakes for kids, and now they like snakes and all this different stuff. So it's like, it is kind of opening that door, and it's nice to have educated people and responsible people kind of, introducing people to their first pet snakes.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, it is an important piece. And I think a lot of times biologists actually forget that that's maybe what got them into it as well. And so, I mean, there's so many different issues. And I think as we grow, we're kind of paving out some of those speed bumps along the way. But, for example, pet tubers have become this massive thing. And I think a lot of that's people's exposure. You take a biologist who Googles reptile hobby, they're going to get a bunch of pet tubers. And I'm not going to slam every pet tuber, but there's a lot of not ideal, role models out there in terms of pets. And that, if that's the face of our industry, then that's actually not ideal for everybody. And you could see why they would not like that,
I think, and we've talked about this before, I think in any hobby and really anything you do in life, it's important to acknowledge the role that everyone plays in it, even if that role,
even if it's an importer,
right, or even if that role seems contrary to your role, like you said with the rainbow boas. Like, you had to have that rainbow boa to be interested in donating to this conservation one, or you are getting more people interested in rainbow boas or getting more people interested in donating to this because you have one. Like, even though it feels contrary to their conservation work, like you are playing a role in all of it. The biologists are playing a role in, how we keep or how we might educate people. And we're playing a role by educating more people. Like, everyone has a role in it. Like you said, the importers or wholesalers or whoever it is, like, it might seem contrary to what you're doing, but people play a role.
And animals may be kind of martyrs to getting people interested. And that's super unfortunate, but it's also, I don't know. It's where we are.
Yeah, no, I agree. And you can talk to so many biologists who are huge fans of the hobby. And I've said a lot of times in the show that the hobby can play a role in scientific research that academics cannot. Hobbyists pour every ounce of themselves, including their money and their heart, into a project, and they will come out on the other end with this massive wealth of information that a university just can't do. It costs them thousands of dollars. There's people, constantly cycling through different masters and thesis projects and whatnot. You can't tell somebody to say, hey, spend 20 years working with this one species and then come back and tell us how it works. But there's hobbyists all over the place you guys talked to Corey Imar with, the croc monitors, and there's people all over the place that are just working with species and can tell you every little thing about them. And scientists go to them and say, can you help us out with this?
Yeah, and I think that if we make that more of a usual thing, and I think part of that is looking more legitimate, and that is kind of beefing up your husbandry, showing them that, we just went to Cody and Pia's, who they're from terrestrial and arboreal. They have not giant, but a decent venomous collection, but it's all in zoo quality enclosures.
It's giant to
me.
It's like anything over zero is giant
a zoo. Yeah.
They have what? How many venomous? At least 12, 50, 50, 30.
50?
No, I was like 12 in the main. I don't know. They have a lot.
It doesn't matter, but it's like normal person in Florida with 50 venomous snakes is going to look a lot different than Cody and Pia's collection. They also have zoological experience, so that helps as well. But there's just a level of legitimacy to where if someone came into my reptile room, people would be like, are you sure that's okay that they're in those tubs? There's no one's questioning anything when you have these amazing enclosures with naturalistic setups and planet tanks and stuff like that.
Yeah. There's definitely, I think, an importance in appealing to the non-reptile person. And the really hardcore folks don't like that message because they think, well, those people actually don't know anything about it. So why would we let them dictate how we care for their animal? But it is actually important, I think, that the initial appeal is there for the average person. We want people to think that we are responsible with the hobby itself. But this is one of those things that maybe you guys have an opinion on. I think maybe other pet hobbies like this as well. I'm not sure, but it seems like the reptile hobby does have a lot of stubbornness in it. And I kind of wondered if maybe that was because if you go back, now everybody and their dog has a pet crested gecko. But if you go back 30 years, if you owned reptiles, you were definitely a little bit strange in terms of just the general population. And I wonder if there was like a development of like a defense mechanism of people going like, well, you don't know anything. I love these animals and I'm going to keep care for them. And it's sort of carried over. That's just a thought that popped into my head yesterday. I wonder, do you guys have thoughts on that?
Yeah, it's like people, especially snake people, I think you go away from the mainstream, and also like I kept it and bred it before it was cool to keep and breed also. So it's like maybe, and plus, anyone gets stuck in their ways after doing something for years and years and years. And something that's worked, and it's worked well, it's worked efficiently, especially kept their costs down. They've been able to feed their collection. So I think there's so much weight and there's so many different aspects to that.
I say yes and no. Yes, because same thing Joe said, like, they've had to like prove themselves their whole life to all these people who probably did not respect what they were doing, did not care. I'm sure there's like some built up resentment from years of like having to be like, this is my life. And you have
to prove yourself consistently in the reptile community to get respect.
Yeah. And they probably feel that I work for that. My reason I say no is just because the same thing happens in teaching. It is totally different, but it's the same thing. It's like, I've been teaching for a long time. I've had to fight for the way I teach. You know, teachers are never respected.
You can
by
find
anyone.
a 65-year-old that wants to do corporal punishment or something.
Yeah.
Right. And she'll be like, I did all these kids. Well, yeah, there's all, or, you know, there's all, I think
it's hard to argue with 40 years experience, but also at the same time, you need to evolve. So kind of what's, and we have some great friends who, I mean, you're talking about people who have kept for 40 years and have been at like the top of the hobby in some respects. Like say Keith McPeak is a guy that is in the United States here who keeps Bolin's pythons, which is one of the like the last frontiers as far as really big python, really amazing looking, and people haven't exactly been able to tune in exactly how they breed. But I mean, he's been breeding and keeping for so long, but he keeps on updating his husbandry methods because, first of all, this snake demands it because obviously it's not working for anyone, so you got to do it. But he's also drawing in information from Ari, who's in West Papua, looking at the snakes. He's also looking at different scientific research, which there is almost none because Ari's done pretty much all of it. So yeah. And it's like, you know, this is a guy who's retirement age, but he is still going leaps and bounds above from where he's been. And he keeps on like evolving and reinventing himself.
Right. Yeah. And those species like that are interesting because it exposes that, you know, with the Bolin's python, you have to do that or you're going to get nowhere with it. And other animals, we can stabilize them at a much lower level. But it is that excitement of constantly finding something new to provide and, you know, growing that level of care. That is actually really fun. And so many of us, we can get stuck in not wanting to do that because the animal does carry on without any issues. But once you start adding different things and start trying new care styles, it can be really exciting.
Absolutely. And Ryan Cox said it's really just poor people versus rich people. But people who have money to put into their collections. But
well, it can be that. But also, if I mean, you can have one animal and spend as much as you can on a rack. You know. So it depends how you allocate the money. And I think so many times we get stuck thinking that if you only have one animal, you have no credibility and it's not very fun. And you can make a beautiful enclosure and have a lot of engagement with that animal with just one of them, you know?
But in all honesty, as someone who does reptile shows and stuff like that, like you talk to some people and it's bad because we're holding people's opinion too highly, obviously. But you talk to people and it's like, even if you have a table of corn snakes, some people will talk down to you and be like this and this. And I'll be like, well, and then I start talking about my olive python. And they'll be like, oh my God, like you have it. It's like, you need to keep on proving yourself or else people will talk down to you. And I feel like, and sometimes we've catered too much to that.
Yeah. It's funny because I always see myself as somebody who's outside the hobby because I live in such an insular place. Almost it's sort of isolated in a lot of ways. And I mean, in the States, you guys have these massive expos and whatnot, something that I've not even really experienced before. So I don't see a lot of that side to it. And I can almost look at it from a different perspective and people might attack me for that and whatnot, but I'm actually okay with that because I have not had that experience to see that side of it. And it's there. And obviously you guys are experiencing it as well.
Yeah. And it's something that, I don't know, you realize like, oh, why am I really working with this? Is this giving me some type of clout, or is it that I really love, and I really love all the animals that I have, but some of the things it's like.
We really love corn snakes. We really do.
Yeah. But it's like, why were we keeping this? Well, when I didn't really like the behavior of the animal or working with the animal every day. And that, and that just kind of goes with, I mean, how do you feel about trying out certain species that you like? Because I mean, I've kept things that I'm like king snakes, for example. And it's like after taking one off of your finger, for the 20th time, it gets kind of old. It's like, I want to stop. I want to stop having this snake that grabs onto me and holds on for dear life every single time I open the tub. And that's just my personal preference. So how do you feel about like kind of testing your grounds as far as what species you like?
Well, I think that is almost entirely dependent on the community you're surrounded by. If you're surrounded by it, you have a couple even like a 4 or 5 close friends who are all reptile keepers. And if you guys can swap, if you say, look, I am sick of these king snakes, I kind of hate them, and I would love for you to take them off my hands. And if you can, even if you can sell them to good homes, I think that's totally fine. I don't see any issue with that at all. For me, I would almost feel, I mean, there's a chance that I could not get rid of it in a way that I'd feel comfortable with, like sending it to some rando. I mean, there's some great people in the community as well, but there's just not very many of them. But I think as long as you have a good place to put them, testing species, there's nothing wrong with that.
Yeah, I think it's also tough because, we would be able to find someone to take the animal, but a person at a reptile show, unfortunately, just picking up one snake may not have the outlet to do so, and they'll just put it on Craigslist or something.
Yeah. Yeah, that is, I mean, clearly that's and that was sort of the initial thing that got me rolling down this hill, was looking at the classifieds online and going, okay, there's actually a lot of animals on here that are A, in rough shape, and B, you can tell the individual actually has no idea how to care for them. And they're always asking for crazy amounts of money too. They're like, I spent $800 and I'm going to give it for $700. Like, you didn't spend $800 on an Exoterra, enclosure or whatnot.
Full setup cost $300. I'm only asking $259.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, it's sort of strange in that sense. But yeah, I mean, I think that because the reptile industry is becoming way more mainstream, it's got a much larger safety net, and there's a lot more people that, you're not that weird guy on the street that has a basement full of snakes. It's actually kind of cool in a lot of ways. So that's incredibly helpful.
Yeah. And we had a question from the chat. Jay was asking, I mean, how do you feel about, kind of the decorated tubs as far as making tubs functional? And we have a decent example. It's like David Brahms. He makes these tub conversion kits where you can basically make an arboreal enclosure, but it's a tub. And it's like, how do you feel? I mean, I feel like there may be ways of getting in the middle somehow of like, maybe you can be a little bit cost efficient, but also have something that gives you that adequate space.
Look, I am all for that. And again, I'm not a bioactive proponent that says everybody must be high level, zoo level enclosures. My only goal is to allow people to start thinking that progression can happen even in tubs. So I think having that arboreal it's just a little 3D printed plastic device, right?
Yeah, I'm actually I'll share the screen.
Oh, yeah, sure.
Yeah, but he does a bunch of different things. But you can see like this here is a little water bowl holder.
It was on the perfect picture a second ago.
So these are just like overturned tubs that you basically put a frame on the top, and then you can actually put sliding glass in there. So you're basically turning a tub into an enclosure.
Yeah, no, I think that's great, and it's just giving. Yeah, those are the things I was thinking of. That's what you're talking about, right?
Yep.
Yeah, so he has perch systems. He has all different kinds of perches that any type of Amazon or green tree may like. He has water ball holders, but also these like tub conversion kits that are really cool.
Yeah, I think that's awesome. And I think one of the cool challenges, especially for some of the smaller breeders that have maybe some more flexibility with their bottom line, is if they're not trying to be a hugely profitable business, is there ways you can continue to breed but add enrichment to the animal's enclosure? And I think that's a great challenge for the smaller breeders, because they do have that flexibility. I mean, there's massive breeders that are breeding 10,000 animals. They're not going to go and buy a whole bunch of these things and see if it works, But if we can get the smaller breeders to start experimenting and just go, hey, look, the thing is, the payoff is not going to be something extraordinary, and that may be the hang up on this whole scenario. But maybe the payoff will come from a personal level where you get to see the animal climbing and you realize, wow, if it's there, it's going to use it.
Yeah, and I think that goes to kind of say, I mean, how much influence we have over, even though being small breeders, we can still have influence over everything, because a lot of the commercial guys who we know who do it full time, like, they're not even front facing at all. So it's like the people who are actually the smaller breeders, the guys who can afford to put on a better face, I feel, because they're not running it as a full-time business. We may have a little bit more flexibility of, upgrading our stuff.
I think I am a true believer that the small breeders have a lot more power than the larger breeders. Exactly like you're saying, you are on the internet, you're exposing yourself to how you're caring for, and you have that flexibility. And and you can promote that. You can say, this is how I care for my animals. And if you have people that are coming into the industry as non-reptile people, if they look at a rack system and then they look at something that looks like this that you're showing me on the screen here with a bunch of green tree pythons in these, which one are they going to go with? They're going to go with something that looks more natural. And in the end, one of the arguments is that it doesn't make a difference to the animals, but the thing is that it actually does. And there's a lot of scientific evidence that shows that enrichment is important. And all you have to do is give the animal an opportunity to climb and then watch it climb and go, if I didn't have this, he wouldn't have done it. And I would almost feel guilty taking it out at this point.
Yes. And I feel like right now I've been running a little experiment with, I had a animal that was a little bit of a problem feeder, and we did a video where we did like a beginner corn snake setup and like a very simple, aspen bedding, hide, some foliage to move around on, and water bowl. And now it's like I put a mouse in there and he comes and gets it, and he's less shy, more active, if that makes any sense, instead of previously he was in like a Chinese takeout container, because I mean that's pretty much what most corn snake small colubrid breeders, because or else they pretty much escape everything else.
Right.
So you keep them under wraps, and it's like once they get to this like 6 to 8 month mark, they're easily the length of that takeout container, and I start feeling bad because they don't have obviously enough room to move around. They have no height. And I've just seen the benefit of keeping this one snake like a pet. And what's messed up is that even me, who has hundreds of snakes, I feel more connected, because that's a snake that should be for sale. And I automatically feel more connected with him despite having 200 snakes, just because he's the one off in the enclosure. I don't know why.
Well, because you also put in the time to like try it out, not like you're not putting in the time for the other ones, but you're doing kind of putting in the time for things you've done a million times, boiling the pinkies, doing all these, all those different things we've tried 7 trillion times to get all these picky eaters to eat, but putting it in this like pet setup is something we haven't tried. So it's something new, and it worked.
Yeah, well, and a huge part of that is watching different behavior and interacting with the animal in a different way. And it does give you a deeper connection with that animal. And yeah, it becomes gratifying really quickly. And you actually don't have to make a crazy change or go out and do this expensive giant enclosure. It's like 1 or 2 small things, and all of a sudden there's a deeper connection, because especially for people that are coming into the hobby, we really want them thinking about what niche do these animals exist in the wild, and is there any elements that you can add to their enclosure that have aspects of it. I'm not asking you to recreate a giant Amazonian rainforest, but is there leaf litter or something that you can provide to the animal, because the animal is actually genetically almost crafted to exist in an environment that we've sort of plucked it out of there. And yeah, they can live in a plain tub, but is there something else that we can provide them that will open up more behavioral opportunities for them? Which it's hard to argue that would be a bad thing.
Yeah. What's the hang up on giving enrichment? I mean, there's no...
You know what it is.
Money.
Space and money.
Yeah.
Space and
which
money.
all work together.
The whole world is space.
But
and
I mean,
money.
is there something that anyone could do, to give at least a little enrichment?
You could do a number of things. If you don't have substrate, you could add substrate. If you could add a larger water dish. You could add one of those little climbing apparatuses that you were showing, or put a stick in. I challenge you to just go take a stick. You can find a stick outside and clean it off, maybe put it in the oven for a little while to kill off anything, and put it in one of the tubs and watch your snake interact with it. I promise you that within an hour or within maybe the day, your snake will go investigate it. And that is part of its natural behavior. It has the ability to interact with new things that are placed in its environment. It's not stressed out. It's not sitting in a corner. Those are the types of things that you can do. Very, very simple. Leaf litter, larger water dish, things like that are it's immediate payoff when you watch the animal's behavior.
Yeah, and that's something that we've gained from, say, Riley Jimison, who's also a zookeeper, and I know he like puts other snake sheds sometimes in enclosures and stuff like that. And we used to see zoos as the highest quality in keeping, and now I feel like we keep totally different from them. So that's kind of I like to gain things from them as well, because they obviously are going above and beyond, and they're also have to always be like PR friendly and really careful about that kind of stuff.
Yeah. Well, there are two things. One, your animal is really the best teacher. Watch how they behave. It's once you've worked with an animal long enough, you can understand the difference between stressed and relaxed and inquisitive and hungry and whatnot. And the other thing is, as keepers, we need to ask ourselves, do I actually think I'm done learning about this species? Like, is there a chance that there's a few things that we haven't uncovered as an industry or as a hobby that are going to be, mind blowing? Like, I mean, UV light, for example, was one of the things. We had tons of metabolic bone disease with lizards and whatnot. We don't know if there's something like that that can maybe extend the lives of our animals or just keep them healthier. So to get stuck in that fixed mindset, it is to make the statement, I know everything about this creature and I no longer need to acquire anything more. And it's actually not a fun place to be mentally,
Yeah, and it's something to where, like you said, I mean, that invigorates your excitement about everything.
Mm-hmm.
And really, I don't know. I feel like how do we present it in a way that, doesn't seem like a challenge for people to do, or like that they're not doing enough? Because I never want to get across the point that, like, I don't want people to think that, like, you're an animal abuser if you keep in a tub, because that's also not true. Like,
You say it just like that. Like, you guys have probably said in this podcast 10 times, like, I'm not an expert. This isn't the only way. I'm just saying my opinion. And I think that's something that you can't ever stop saying.
And I'm a tub keeper. So
you have to say it all the time. Like, this is what I've learned. This is the research I've done. I'm not an expert. Like, I think saying it like that is the way to keep people like interested without feeling,
but it's also, what are
forced
people typically interested in? Like, getting bit by a snapping turtle, my giant pythons around my neck type of thing.
Yeah.
Like, enrichment isn't very sexy in compared to that stuff.
Yeah, that's very true. You has to be an interaction between you and your animal, and not an interaction between you and a YouTube thumbnail. Like, if there's blood squirting out from a leopard gecko in someone's hand, that I get why that gets clicks. But what's much more interesting is providing something that the leopard gecko can utilize and interact with, and then getting to watch it. Like, everything doesn't have to be this sensational thing. And yeah, exactly. Like, I've said many times that the industrialized style care for breeding might be what is necessary to keep the animals safely, by keeping them clean and healthy, and keeping, obviously disease and illness is a legitimate risk when you're keeping hundreds of animals. And maybe the rack systems are what you need to access as a breeder. And I've said that so many times, and I'm not a proponent for saying get rid of rack systems at all. I just think that maybe there's more we can do with the racks, and maybe the person that has one ball python or one corn snake doesn't have to keep in a plain sterile tub.
Yeah, I think it's also important to bring up the fact that, if you're someone who has an open facility constantly, meaning like you're acquiring animals and, maybe you're not properly quarantining, or even if you are, you're still assuming some risk. And then if you have them all naturalistically set up and you're bringing in new animals, if you got mice in your collection, you're done. That'd be so terrible.
Yeah. Oh, exactly. I mean, and the other thing we need to watch for as an industry is, we tend to butt heads a lot, but we all are here because we love reptiles. And there are groups that take advantage of us fighting. So, animal rights groups and especially like government legislation will come in and make these just bizarre laws that clearly were not consulted by anyone that's ever seen a reptile, apparently. And if we aren't showing that we can take responsibility for the animals that we care for, and that we actually can work together as a community, then these things pop up we don't get a seat at the table when these things happen. And there are people that are doing a great job, like Ryan McVeigh from Zilla and whatnot, and Josh Jones from PJAC. There's some people that go up and bat for us, but there's also a lot that gets done kind of behind our back in a way. And we don't have a lot of power when we're like, yeah, well, we released thousands of Burmese pythons into the Everglades. And, so it's tricky that way.
Yeah, that's slippery.
Let's not go down that road.
I loved your podcast. I forget her name, but I believe she was a biologist down in Florida.
Jenna Cole. Yeah.
There you go. And that was, I don't want to say anything. People will fucking have me burned at the stake. You can go listen to that podcast.
Yeah, okay. We don't have to go down that road. Maybe I have different
No,
opinions.
I mean, you can go down it. I won't go too hard.
Yeah, well, the only point I would make with that is when events like that happen, I don't know enough about the situation necessarily to comment about it, but it gives us less authority when we can say, hey, we can responsibly care for these. Yeah, it's a terrible situation in Florida. Maybe that's not the general opinion, but I assume it is. That can cause bans in Minnesota, when the temperature drops down to -40 because people at the table don't understand anything about reptiles, and we can actually lose the ability to care for them, which has that cascading effect of, if we can't care for them, then we don't expose kids to them who don't become biologists, and we don't have breeders working on these amazing projects and protecting the wild, what I think a lot of us care about deeply. If we can't get together and sit at the table, then we lose that opportunity.
And really, the only thing that suffered throughout this whole thing is the animals and the Everglades themselves. I mean, the whole area has been vilified. I don't see how like Florida tourism likes the fact that all they do on the news is tell people that there's giant pythons invading it. And then at the same time, we also can't be of the opinion of, well, there's monkeys down there, there's all these plants, because I feel like that's what we like to do. We like to say, well, yeah, there's berms, there's green iguanas, there's tegus, but look at this going on. I think it's all an issue and it's all a problem, but we need to also kind of take our responsibility.
Yeah, and maybe that's not a popular opinion, but
it's very unpopular, by the way.
Is that right? Wow, that's amazing. I guess I am very insulated. But the thing is what we'll find is the more responsibility we can take over everything, the more control we'll have. And to just write off things as if it's not part of our world is to say we don't have full control over this, which is also to say you should make rules that prevent me from doing things. And that's exactly what's happening in a lot of cases. Just removing the Everglades completely from the example, it happens all over. The little towns or states make these crazy rules that don't have any bearing in science or biology, but they happen. So the more responsibility we can take, the better. And I don't think it's a bad thing. And maybe like you guys are saying, there's some different opinions out there, but usually responsibility is good.
Yeah. We have this American mindset, don't take my rights kind of deal. So that's pretty much how Americans operate. But
yeah, and I hear that as well. And I find the best way to protect your rights is to show that we can be responsible with what's happening. And maybe part of that is just progressing the hobby, like removing the Burmese pythons from the situation in general. But can we make the hobby appeal to people that aren't in it? Like, look how cool this is. We have kids involved in science. That's amazing.
I think a lot of times maybe the only exposure there is to our hobby is that people saw something on Discovery Channel that said that the pet trade is responsible for this. So we have it. Our friend Sean Gray he does the herp shows, which are reptile shows, and like people have randomly commented like, "Oh, are you gonna buy berms and put them down in the Everglades?" And he's like, that's some people's only their only exposure to our industry, and that's also a shame.
Yes, yeah. I mean, the it's a good story, right? There's giant 35-foot snakes. Like, it's always this crazy thing that doesn't exist roaming the Everglades. And yeah, clearly it's an issue, but yeah, the news and the media never helps us out in any way, almost, unless it's like Steve Irwin or something. Most of the time, reptiles are painted as these horrible creatures.
Yeah, the guy who would take the most venomous snake in the world by the tail and whip it around. I mean, that's how we're.
Yeah, that's our guy.
How bold he was. I don't know. I feel like that gets swept under the rug.
Yeah, people now are like, don't show bites, don't do this. He was free-handedly doing all this stuff, and we all loved him. So
yeah, it's true. But
I guess.
What's that? Yeah. The rules have changed a little bit.
Yeah.
Backtracking a little bit, I wanted to make sure I got in Ryan's question. It's a total subject change, but now I can't find it. Shoot. Where is it? Do you do natural diets and food variation, like actually feed on a regular schedule and different prey items?
Well, it's something that I am interested in. For sure with my geckos, I do. With my crested gecko, I try when he accepts other prey. With my day gecko, I do. I have some Arcadia diet, as well as they have a few different powder diets, like a kind of a fruit crested gecko diet, as well as a bug sort of almost like a bug insect diet. I forget what it's called off the top of my head. And then a bunch of different sort of insect prey items as well. And with the snakes, I have not varied, but it's something that I'm interested in doing. And I feel like because I have boas, I could probably get away with varying diets a little bit. Again, the big issue for me is finding these things. Like I would love to try reptilinks. I don't know if you guys have experience with reptilinks, but I can't get them in Canada. But that's something that I think I would be interested in, just to try variation. But I definitely do fast my boas. They have not eaten since December. They're due to eat tomorrow for the first time since December. And I drop the temperatures and try to replicate some natural feeding cycles, just to allow them to, clean out and go through some of those healing processes that typically fasting initiates.
Yeah, I mean, that's a perfect example. An animal that, sometimes in some parts of the world, they're eating only at certain times of the year. They're eating, and they may be eating migratory birds or, maybe quail or a chick, if you can find it, may be great for your boa.
Exactly. Yeah, there could be, and I don't think I would have any risk of not being able to get them back onto rats if I needed to, just because they are such good eaters. Now, I know other species of snakes are not necessarily the most flexible, but I think maybe you can get them there. It just takes more work, but definitely something that I want to try.
Yeah, and as far as like your local scene and everything like that, I mean, how do you get feeders and
Your
stuff?
local scene. I'm sorry.
Well, no.
I don't know why that just sounds so.
Are you doing like pet store? I mean, you don't have a incredible amount of animals, but are you going to the pet store, or you have some type of feeding company?
Actually, I'm lucky. There's a pet food market that's very close to where I live, and they do like raw food for cats and dogs and whatnot, but they also supply rodent feeders from somebody in the province next to us. So I do have a decent supply. So that's actually relatively easy. In terms of getting different types of feeders, it would be more difficult. But yeah, luckily feeder wise, I'm set for the most part.
And I mean, where do you, when you're in Manitoba, where did you originally get your animals? I mean, did you get your animals shipped in? Did you go to a local reptile show?
Yeah, most of them were from a reptile show, just the one that we have in Manitoba yearly. And there's also one of them I did get shipped in from somewhere in Ontario, which maybe the listeners, if they're American, you guys have heard of Ontario, or maybe not. Toronto.
That's the one we know.
No, it's real bad if you don't know Ontario.
Yeah,
There's
okay, good.
3 places in Canada we know.
Vancouver.
Well,
Toronto.
no, fine. Okay, I feel like everyone knows Montreal.
Yes.
You should know Quebec.
Yes.
Toronto.
Yes.
Ontario.
Vancouver.
Whatever
that
I think that's
part's
it.
called.
I think those 5 are like the ones we know.
So you've heard of, I forget if my jungle carpet python, it definitely came from Ontario. I think it was in Toronto, somewhere in Toronto. So yeah, so there are different ways to get them. Of course, paying for shipping and whatnot is a real killer, but it's not too bad.
Yeah, it seems like people are becoming more free with shipping back and forth from the United States and Canada. So I was kind of curious if you ever had experience with that.
Oh, I've never done that. Actually, is it easy to ship animals between the borders like that?
It seems like it's getting easier. It's expensive, but
yeah.
I believe one of our shipping companies does it here in a pretty like streamlined fashion.
Yeah, we have at least one. I think Reptile Express in Canada does a great job of shipping reptiles in the country. Maybe they do stuff across the border as well.
Yep, that's exactly who I was thinking of.
Oh, okay, yeah. So yeah, they're fantastic. That's who shipped my carpet python. It was pretty much turnkey. I didn't have to do anything except for pay the bill. Yeah,
it would probably be like $250 to $500 for us to import from there, but it makes sense maybe for some animals.
A high dollar animal, maybe.
Yeah, if you really want the animal, and it's funny how the way you perceive the dollar amount can change very drastically. You're like, oh, I don't want to spend more than 200, and then you see it at 600. You're like, well, 600 doesn't seem too bad. You can be pretty flexible with the wallet in the industry.
Well, when you're already spending so much, that little bit doesn't feel
exactly.
It's such a weird like up and down. Like,
well, and we've talked about this a lot, is where we'll spend $1,000 on an animal, but only want to spend $5 to keep it.
Right.
But also, I mean, you could probably buy $100 animal and spend the money on keeping the animal. So I guess it just depends on where your priorities lie.
Yeah, it is. It is interesting, especially when it comes to morphs, because the animal is the same no matter what. Essentially, you're just paying for the different, phenotype basically, and so it's hard to justify spending more on a care for an animal that's essentially the same. It just looks different. It's tricky that way.
Isn't that so weird, man? We assign prices to these things that have zero like actual value. I mean, that sounds bad, but I mean, like,
takes a large group of people liking the same thing in an animal.
Yeah.
And I wanted to ask you, like, what is it about boas? Since you have so many boas like that, what was that call or that attraction to you about boas?
I'm not sure, actually. I just love the way they look. Like, even just a natural type boa, just the body shape, and I knew that they kind of out of the box were very inquisitive animals, and they certainly are, and that was a lot of fun. I also love that part of the world too. I've been down to Costa Rica a few times, and I really enjoy. I haven't been to the Amazon rainforest, but I've been to Central America, and I love that part of the world. So I think it was just a combination of a bunch of things, and yeah, they're great animals.
Did you get a chance to herp down there, or are you down there for something else?
The first time I was down there to train, I used to be an athlete, so I didn't really get a chance to do much. But the second time we did a little bit. But
what did you say?
The first time I went down there, I went down there to train. I used to be an athlete, so it was mostly training. I wasn't doing much herping. The second time I went, there was a little bit, but it was actually, if you're not guided, it can be quite difficult. You just kind of walking through the rainforest looking for stuff, and we saw a couple interesting frogs and basilisks all over the place, and iguanas and whatnot. But and I think we did see at least one crocodile, so that was kind of cool.
Yeah, that's awesome. Do you plan on incorporating that as far as do you like, or do you want to go traveling and find herps? Is that your thing, or?
Well, I would love to. I love traveling, and I would love to go down to some places. I don't know if it would do anything with animals at home, or just for on my own sort of personal agenda. If I would, I definitely love going to explore. So I will eventually go back down to South America for sure. Especially because I have this somewhat close ties with this charity now, and they are constantly inviting me down to Peru and kind of going to that patch of land that they have saved, and it sounds amazing. So it's definitely on my bucket list.
Random aside, but have you read Mother of God by Paul Rosalie?
No, I haven't.
All right, I'll send you one. It's about the Peruvian rainforest.
Oh, cool.
A copy of it. But
that would be awesome.
Yeah, you should read it, because it's all about conservation in the Amazon, in particular, that area of the Amazon, which is like just a very precious resource to us in many different ways.
Yeah, if you've never been into a rainforest, it's impossible to describe. But as soon as you walk into it, it's really a breathtaking experience. It's just like the magnitude of these forests it's mind-blowing, and maybe partly that's what has guided me in sort of drifting into the more enrichment style of care, because you see, like, I did see one boa dead on the road in Costa Rica. Other than that, there was no other ones, but you can imagine the habitat and the climate and everything that they live in, and it's just amazing, and you almost feel guilty in a way coming home to and at the time I had my boa in basically a plain tub, and it was like, that now that I have a frame of reference, I see this in a different way.
How deep do you go? I've been thinking of doing like native plants, like trying to actually get like the native plants from the region. I mean, how close do you want to mimic nature?
I can't. When you got a shipment
You're looking at me judging me.
Yes, because when you got a box of leaves and sticks the other day, it just felt so wrong. And now you're talking about paying. Now you're talking about paying more money for leaves and sticks.
Hey, well, at least you have North American species, so you can like just go out and get some natural stuff from outside. I mean,
I paid someone to do that.
He paid, right? Thank you. We have it outside, but he paid money for nature.
Hey, that's okay too.
Sanitize them, dry them out.
Yeah, I've done that as well. I've done both, but I mean, I have gone down that road as well, looking for the natural plants. And the thing is, for me, I'm not the best caregiver to plants, I'm finding out. So for me, it's like whatever will grow without dying easily, I'm going to start with. I know people, I forget what episode of the podcast when I talked to Roy Arthur Blodgett from, he has Amazon puffing snakes, and he has gone like all out in terms of looking. He does like specific rain cycles and definitely plants that are in sort of native to their habitat. And it's really cool. And one day I think I would love to do that as well for the boas once they're in something a little bit bigger. I mean, boas will destroy plants, I'm pretty sure. So I have to figure out that.
Oh yeah, I guess that's the thing is with so many snake species, the bigger they get, and most of them get big enough to pretty much ruin any of your good work.
Oh yeah, and they absolutely will. They'll just crush everything. So that's a challenge in itself, and I don't know that there's certainly challenges with going bioactive straight with snakes as well in terms of just like scale rot and too much moisture and things like that. So maybe the move is going to more of a potted plants or something along those lines.
Yeah, kind of what are you doing right now for the snakes as far as like substrate goes in specific?
I mostly just use cocoa husk. I like that, especially now because it's so dry in the winter. So that holds a little bit more moisture. So that's generally what I use. Sometimes I'll use aspen, but I like the coconut the best just because I like the way it looks, and that's typically what I stick with. And then with my rainbow boa, I just kind of use a mix of some cypress mulch and a few other things that I just generally mix into a pot and throw in there.
And so, have you done any fully bioactive enclosures for snakes?
No, I haven't, and I've added some plants in at some points, and again, they kind of crush them. But I think I'm going to start with potted plants, like even using cork rounds almost as a place to store plants in. I'll kind of see what that goes like to begin with, and eventually the enclosures I have right now are not capable of taking bioactive. They will just rot, I assume. So once I get some new ones, then I think I will try.
Are you working with some wood or?
Yeah, the one.
Of enclosures
that's clearly wood behind him.
Well, not everyone can see it. All right.
Yeah, that's the beauty of a podcast on video. Sometimes it's easy to forget. Hey, yeah, this one is wood. It's actually an old shelving unit that I converted to a boa enclosure. Now it's lined with sort of rubber floor and whatnot, so I'm not it's not gonna fall apart or anything. But I do feel like if I somehow put plants in there, it's not going to last super long. So the next ones will be more of a PVC enclosure.
Yes, like with the bioactive substrate, with the plants, with everything involved, comes the humidity, comes the warped wood.
Yeah,
comes the rotting of the wood eventually, and yeah.
Yeah, so it's always a challenge to figure out how the balance. Like you said, you don't want to go too far before you're comfortable, and then either damage your enclosure or damage the healthier animal. So it's just more of a steady crawl towards something that's maybe a little bit more enriching.
And that one right below you, that's PVC, right?
Yeah, this one. Oh, yeah, this one backwards. Yeah, that's just general sort of 4x2x2 PVC enclosure. That's where my rainbow boa is in. Just obviously with the addition of needing high humidity, I needed something that was going to hold, especially here with the low humidity. I needed something that could trap some air in there.
Yeah, how's your experience? Because obviously a lot of snake keepers will go immediately to the tubs if you're having like humidity issues. And what's your experience with in a kind of your arid home situation and PVC enclosure?
It's been pretty good. I've had to block off a few of the vents just with saran wrap just to keep some air in there. And then obviously I have a humidifier in the room. This room stays closed 100% of the time in the winter, and it's just constantly being humidified. So I try to keep the air in here at 50% as best as I can. That's typically where it sits as long as the humidifiers aren't empty. As soon as I open the door, it just plummets down to basically nothing. So it's more room management than enclosure management, which is actually a lot easier in most cases.
And are you doing anything to keep your ambient heat up, or are you keeping it pretty much room temp?
Yeah, pretty much room temp. Everything. There's baseboard heaters in here, which are kind of a nightmare as well because they tend to dry out the air, but the humidifier does a good job sort of counteracting that. So again, it's just mostly room temp. It'll drop down to 70 at night, and the enclosures still have heat and whatnot during the night, so the enclosures stay warmer. And for the geckos, everything turns off, and they're happy to go down into the 60s. That's no problem. But in the day, yeah, up to 75, 76 type thing for your Fahrenheit numbers.
Yeah, that's always tricky. So obviously we've talked about day gecko, crested gecko, 2 boas, but what are the other animals
carpet.
that you have? Carpet.
Yeah, I have a jungle carpet python who's is he a year old now or is he 2 years old? I forget. Yeah, I think he's about 2. And then, yeah, the Brazilian rainbow boa. And that's kind of where I'm stopping for now. I really do love each of those animals. I love the way they look. I like the way they move. And I'm just going to slowly work with them and do what I can to see more of them and to see more natural behaviors. And that is the end goal for me, is to see them behaving in the most natural way possible. Because actually what we want, I think, if you were to go herping, like you just love to see them roaming around outside. That's so cool. And you can actually do that inside as long as you provide them with some of those key elements,
And what I found interesting is that you're not necessarily a keeper that likes to go hands on with your animals, right?
No, I pretty much never handle my animals. I'm very much a visual person. I certainly don't handle my geckos. They've really never been handled. The snakes I will handle more for maintenance when I need to. I'll let them, pull them out to weigh them and whatnot and clean their enclosures. And typically when people come over is when they want to hold the snakes, and that's totally fine. But generally, I'm more of a watcher than a toucher. Yeah.
I don't know if that.
Wait, I'm sorry. I was typing. I just came in on the end of that.
Yeah, it sounded exactly is the way I wanted it to. I watch my animals rather than pulling them out and handling them. Let's put it that way.
And how do you feel like, I'm sure because exposure is a real thing as far as reptiles. Like, I don't know if you can necessarily tame a reptile, but they can definitely become tolerant. So like, how do your snakes respond in comparison? I mean, for a person who doesn't handle very often.
Well, the boas are totally fine. Like, they are such a calm animal just by their general demeanor. And typically if I slide open the door to their enclosure, they will investigate the open hole and typically come out. And there's almost no stress if I pick them up. The python, he's a little bit crazy. If I go in there and try to pull him out, he does get a little bit wild. But once you get him out, he's okay. But I don't handle him very often. I probably should handle him a little bit more because he's probably going to get kind of mean if I don't. Just kind of habituate him a little bit to handling. But the boas they're totally fine. It's really amazing that they just totally tolerate it. I've never been struck by any of them. The three of them have never struck me or bit me. And they're just super calm.
How much of that is the animal? How much is that you being a educated keeper, as far as, not going in there and grabbing them or something?
Well, it's probably a combination of both. I think that typically boas have a slightly calmer demeanor, and then obviously not throwing my hands in and ripping them out plays a big role in them not being aggressive. Letting them come out or just giving them a quick little tap with the hook just to let them know I'm there, I think really does help a lot. We all know to read the body language of a snake. If you're going in there when it looks defensive or hungry, you're probably going to get tagged. And just reading the animal is super important.
Absolutely. And as far as your podcast, I feel like we've gone this whole time now about your podcast. And did you start like a blog before your podcast, or?
Yeah, well, I guess my life kind of came to a change at one point, because I was an athlete for my whole life and that was my main focus. And I was kind of going to school, and I finished school and I retired from the sport, and I was sort of left with a bunch of time. Like, I was sort of used to training 3 to 4 hours a day for the last decade of my life. And then that was a big hole, and I needed something to do with it. I still coach swimming. That's a sport that I was in. But I still kind of had this flexibility during the day. So I decided I needed to utilize my time for something. So I started this blog, and I think the very first thing I did was convert these shelving units into enclosures. And I made that video, and then I started writing a blog and just kind of went from there. And I hit a point where I realized that to continue to produce content on YouTube, you almost need to perpetually buy a new animal because you're out of ideas. It's like, well, now I got to go get something different to talk about. And I wasn't willing to do that because I don't have the space or the money.
Videos are pretty lame if you're doing the same animals every single month.
Yeah, exactly. Like, here it is again. This is the same guy you saw last time. It's like, you're going to run out of ideas so quickly. So the podcast just sort of came to me, and I didn't really have a great vision for it, but I just started it before I could kind of talk myself out of doing it. And then it just sort of accumulated from there. And it's, I guess, I published them first in the sort of fall of 2018, and every 2 weeks I've been sort of posting an episode since then. And it's been an amazing amount of fun. And you guys would know this, but you get to talk to just incredible people all over the world.
And did you have any like intention or focus going in on it and what you wanted to achieve with it?
Well, I left it fairly broad. Obviously, I had that sort of foundation of wanting to discuss ethics of keeping the animals. I did something I did want to explore, like what are we doing here with the hobby? Are there things that we aren't doing that we should? Are there things that we're doing that we shouldn't? And so that was sort of driving some of it. But I also called it Animals at Home for a reason, because I wanted to leave that door open for me to basically talk about whatever I want. I didn't necessarily want it to just be a reptile podcast, and it's been 90% reptile, but I've thrown in some other things now and again. Yeah, the reptile world just keeps expanding. I was like, oh, I'm going to run out of people, but you don't run out of people. You just keep thousands of people to talk to.
It goes deeper and deeper. You find a weird corner with some different people, and it's crazy.
Yeah, it just goes. And no, it's been awesome. So that was kind of how it started, and I didn't have a super specific focus, but it's sort of refined the focus as I've worked through, producing the show.
And I think one thing to note is the fact that you have, a lot of the other reptile podcasts are fairly casual, fairly conversational. You have gone more of the edited route. Somewhere kind of in the middle of there.
Yeah. The show itself is basically not edited, but I do structure it fairly tightly on my end. The guest knows a few of the questions that I'm going to ask, and I sort of frame it in a way so they understand what we're going to talk about. And then I typically have some sense of how I want the conversation to go. I want it to flow as well. I don't want it to seem like question, answer. I do want it to be conversational, but I also have some sense of what I want to get from each guest. And that was just the way I decided to take the show. I think both ways are great. Like, this is awesome. I'm enjoying having just a casual conversation. But for me, I'm a little bit more anal in a way where I need to have like a little bit of an idea of what's going to happen,
I was about to ask, is it more just your personality?
Oh, for sure. Yeah.
Yeah.
I like to have some prep done.
Well, and I love, basically what I was trying to say is I really love your almost like, I think NPR does this a lot, where the person starts talking and then you fade out and then you kind of explain what's going on and then you fade back in, and just, I love that style of it and that editing. So yeah, I really appreciate that aspect.
Yeah. You learn it from learning from you're just listening to other shows. It can, and you guys are great at this as well, where when the person's talking, not constantly going, it's like super annoying to the listener. So it's just learning how to have conversations. It's a skill in itself. And you find that as soon as you're on air with someone, you need to navigate and not get, yourself stuck in sentences and whatnot.
I think it's a lot easier for us doing it video, because I can shake my head. I can shake my head.
Yeah. Oh yeah. When I'm recording shows, I'm just shaking my head the whole time. Like, yes, I'm listening, but I'm not going to say that I'm listening.
Right. The one time we were on our friend's podcast, her petaculture podcast, and theirs is just audio. And, I'd done our podcast so many times, but it was like something completely new, doing just audio. I didn't know where to look. I didn't know where to be, or
we were stepping on each other all over the place. We
ended up separating, right? He was in the bedroom and I came downstairs, because it's like we couldn't be in the same room but not be. It's weird how different the same. It's still a podcast, but doing it audio, it's so different still.
It is so different, yeah. And some people, they'll turn the camera on, but then ask that I don't use it to publish onto YouTube, which I'm totally fine with. But it's definitely a lot easier when you can see you can read their face a little bit, or else you're like, are you even there?
Yeah, and that enables us to kind of take a back seat. I know that this one's been very conversational back and forth, but sometimes you just take a back seat and let, especially with, say that interview that you had. Sorry, I forgot her name again. But it's at times it's you could hear that she had a direction she was going. So you let her give her full thoughts on everything and give it some space, because, someone effectively getting a point across, it doesn't need your interruption in the middle, which we're all trying to learn. But
well, and I mean, there's also the issue of having it over the internet. There's that delay, so you almost you get stuck in those where you're interrupting each other. It's like, oh, sorry, you go, oh, no, you go, and so it's better to just stay quiet and let them finish completely before you jump in.
And there's some people who talk that way, though. That
Yes.
The way they talk, just not slow, but pause. Some people, just the way they talk has a pause in it. It's oh shit, I thought they were done. And there's some podcasts where we've done it 30 times and it'll be over and we're like, why do we keep doing that? But it's so hard when that's just the way they talk. And we already have this question forming in our head from the first sentence they said. And we're just trying to wait. And then you fuck up and you both talk at the same time.
Yeah, definitely the hardest thing is listening to the guest and remembering the question you want to ask. because you're just like, please finish so I can ask this question or else I'm going to forget. You're not even really listening at that point. You're just repeating the question 1,000 times in your head. And then they finish. You're like, oh God, I didn't even hear what you said.
It's so true.
Yes.
There'll be podcasts and I'll talk to Joe after and I'm like, babe, I don't know what half the things we talked about were.
Oh yeah, I've done those.
Because you're just trying not to fumble it. You're just like, let's just not screw this up. That's why it's like, it's almost better to be a listener. You learn more.
Oh
because we're always trying to
totally
think of the next thing.
So I rarely re-listen to my episodes because by the time I've edited them, even though I've edited it, I'm listening to it, but you're not really listening to it when you're editing it because you're just kind of listening to the sound and not the words. And then once in a while, I'll go put the episode on in my car or something and be like, wow, I barely remember any of this. It's a great episode.
What I'm always impressed about you, though, is that you do some of these episodes on your own, and it's so fluent and together. And also you do them on video as well. So like, is that just preparation?
Yeah, and some camera tricks as well, depending on which one you're specifically talking about. Like if the ones that I do on my own are typically, especially if it was filmed, I have a script planned, and I don't do a lot of these, but the ones that are, I have, sometimes it's a script or sometimes I have an idea that I want to work out, and it's almost like thinking out loud. But a lot of times when the camera angle changes, that's me taking a break and, screwing up on a word and resetting. And when you listen to it or when you watch it, you can't tell, but it looks like, it's a one fluid thing. But sometimes if I'm reading something for 30 minutes, I was sitting in the chair for 4 hours.
Yeah. Sometimes I'm like, this guy could just read off or can just talk for this long by himself. That's really like, and there's people who can do podcasts like that. And that's always amazing. Blows my mind.
Yeah. The one that I released in January that was by myself, I did that one in one shot, but it took me quite a few chances to do it. It was so hot in this reptile room at the end. Literally the recording you see on YouTube, I am not wearing pants. I'm just in my boxers because I'm just so hot. I'm like trying not to sweat on camera. I'm just trying to get through this 30-minute, forget it was 5,000 word thing that I wrote. I'm like, every mess up, you're like, damn it, got to go back.
Yeah, I think that was actually when you kind of read out your article, right? Out loud.
That's right. Yeah.
So can you explain a little bit of the article and kind of what your general idea was?
Well, that article in general was, I had stumbled across this paper that discussed, maybe some people are familiar with the 5 freedoms of animal welfare. So it's freedom from thirst, freedom from hunger. There's sort of 5 just general characteristics that I think it started in the UK that was designed to sort of monitor the way they were keeping farm animals, and gave them the farmers or the industry a list of, you have to hit some of these points on the head to make sure you're caring for these animals ethically. And the paper that I had found was taking some of those freedoms and rewriting them in ways that made it easy for people to follow. Freedom from thirst, rather than saying freedom from thirst, it was, readily access to fresh water, and, same with food and mental enrichment and space and comfort and whatnot. So basically what I did is I took that and I just did my best to do an audit of the reptile industry now. It's like, if we're going to use these, we don't seem to have a solid structure of how we operate. Everybody has their own idea of things, which is great, but we don't have a governing body, obviously, and we don't necessarily want one, but maybe we want to come up with some rules that typically we want to follow. So I used those 5 provisions and audited the reptile industry. And specifically, I was looking at industrialized style racks. And the question was basically, is this for the average pet keeper who's keeping 1 or 2 animals, is this necessary, or are there some things that we can encourage people to do that can bump them off of that, not to go right full active or bioactive zoo level, but is there something that we can give them to show them that there's more progression that can be made? And one of the examples that I used that we see in the fish hobby was breeding of discus. When you look at a discus breeding setup, it's very plain, 40-gallon tank, couple breeding posts or breeding cones. There's nothing else in it. But if you Google discus tank, you'll see these beautiful giant fish tanks that are planted, and they look like these Amazonian floodplains, and they're really amazing. And that was more of my question, is how, for some reason we get stuck in everybody's keeping, to follow the metaphors, keeping your discus in these breeding tanks. Maybe we're missing some of the point here. And that was kind of how the article went, and somehow it took me 5,000 words to say it.
But I think I saw some people that I wouldn't necessarily think were open to that idea. and I saw them share it on Facebook. So I think that really has something to say with how you approach the topic, how you explained yourself, how, I guess, kind of objective, but also not, not very judgmental at the same time. So kudos for doing that.
Yeah, well, thanks. I appreciate that feedback. And one of the ways you introduce ideas to people is to show them the idea without bringing along some sort of ad hominem attack. As I said, we're here because of the animals, and I can assume that the ball python breeder next to me that's keeping industrial racks loves their animals just as much as I do. So you don't go in guns blazing and chop everybody's head off and try to make a change. It's more so asking questions and getting people to think about things in a different way. Only because that's the things that are going on in my mind, and I feel like I'm just putting them out on the internet for people to kind of be involved in.
Absolutely. And we are winding down here, but as the general direction of the hobby, I mean, do you feel like we are getting to this point where more people are going this direction, more people are going naturalistic, bioactive, all of that stuff, and also paying attention to things like UV and all these things that we didn't mess with that much before?
In general, I'm very optimistic about the hobby. I think that the industrial breeding phase was a phase that will still always be here because we obviously need animals to supply the market. Clearly, that is a hugely engaging part of, and that was the other thing I mentioned in the article. Breeding is fun, and it's a way you can advance the hobby. And so it's always going to be here, and that's fantastic. But I'm also starting to see new people come into the hobby and not necessarily starting with the tub and going to something a little bit bigger with more enrichment. So that's awesome. And I think it's going to continue to do that.
And I think it may have been during your TC interview, TC Houston, and he said something like, you need to try to educate the new people who are coming into the hobby. And because that will eventually kind of just work itself out, because honestly, the older generation, they're going to be stuck in their way to a certain degree.
Yeah, definitely. If we start with the point of, if the goal is, hey, these animals are actually wild animals, and part of our responsibility to them should be providing something that allows them to behave in the natural way. And that's all that I say is we actually want their animals to behave in ways that they naturally do, because that's what they're genetically created to do. Genetically, they're designed to dig or burrow or climb. And I think it's a duty for us to actually provide some of that to them, to allow them to display some of that. And in turn, the caregiver gets this giant benefit because it's really fun to watch. And I think you're absolutely right. If that's the sort of the foundation that we set, I think as the older school people kind of move out of the hobby, we'll have this really good, fresh mindset.
And where do you feel that you're keeping your progression, as well as the podcast and everything like that? Like, what are you looking forward to in the future?
Well, I'm just going to continue to advance my care as slowly as I do. Like, the other thing I say all the time is I'm not rich. I can't just go out and upgrade all these enclosures to how I think I should. So I'm just slowly going to do these things. Like 2 weeks ago, threw the UVB light on, and eventually these enclosures will be larger enclosures, and that's my goal. Just maybe every couple months add something new. My goal is to not get any more animals and just work with the ones I have and just do the best to provide that natural care. And then in terms of the podcast, I don't really have an end game for it. I'm just going to keep producing the show and hopefully exposing the hobby to people. And I get all sorts of incredibly kind messages from people that are enjoying the show. So that usually keeps me going, because as you guys know, it's actually quite a lot of work and a fairly big commitment. And sometimes you don't want to do it at all. And you guys, I'm sure, get tons of messages as well. So that helps. But
yeah, it's like, I don't know if people realize that from the podcast itself, we don't make any money.
Yeah.
Or, it's really not, it's fruitful to us to talk to people. It's the people that we get to talk to, and also the people that we get to expose to our audience at the same time.
Out of the kindness of our hearts.
No, it's kind of selfish. We get to meet cool people and talk to
yeah,
people.
but we share that with
But we share it, which makes it okay. Less selfish.
And I think the only other thing that I would say that we can finish off in is that it's really, and this is something else that I had mentioned in the article, is it's important to understand the place and the role the hobby plays in your life. And I think for almost all of it, it generates a sense of purpose and a responsibility. And it's really important that we nurture that and we're all here for that. This idea of, I mean, I've talked to so many people, and I'm sure you guys have as well, who their animals have actually saved their lives in some ways. Either they were in a horrible spot, they were making terrible decisions with their life, they were into drugs or alcohol, and they couldn't control themselves. And a lot of times just caring for a crested gecko has changed the trajectory of their life. And in turn, that sort of radiates. If you have somebody in your friend group that's super depressed and upset, and that crested gecko changes their life for the positive, that radiates amongst the friend group and radiates amongst the family. And I think that's really important. And we certainly don't want to lose that, because there are some people who actually rely on the hobby for their health. And that's what we want. We do want to make sure the responsibilities we're taking that responsibility for the hobby and progressing it to the level that it can be progressed together.
Absolutely. I think these animals have presented us all, the three of us, so much.
Mm-hmm.
And we need to be stewards of the hobby because, it has benefited us in many ways, just mentally. And,
Mm-hmm.
It's nice having a hobby that is not destructive, and you can make it into a very positive thing.
Absolutely.
So, Dillon, if anyone wants to reach out to you, where can they find you?
You can go to animalsathome.ca. That's the Canadian. I'm sure you guys.
Hey.
Stop.
So many people are like, I sent you an email, but you didn't respond. I'm like, well, you probably sent it to .com and somebody random got it. So anyway, animalsathome.ca. But really the easiest, if you just Google Animals at Home, my YouTube channel will pop up, and you can search Animals at Home on any sort of podcasting app, and it's there. And same with Instagram. I'm pretty bad with my Instagram. I'm not a huge Instagrammer, but I do post when I post new episodes and videos and whatnot. So I'm out there if you search it.
Awesome.
So I'm in it. Another level of podcast, having two people not talking over each other. If you want to reach out to us, Port City Pythons on YouTube, Port City Pythons podcast on YouTube, and Port City Pet, which we promise we'll be putting another video.
These are all new. I'm actually working with an editor now, and we're trying to severely figure things out as far as severely. Yeah, that's what I'm saying is it's been a disaster, but we're slowly trying to figure it out. And I think that's what happens kind of when you bring anyone new into the equation. And and for me to relinquish control is
not easy.
Damn. Yep. So we're working on it.
Okay, great outro. Port City Pythons on Instagram, Port City Pythons on Facebook, PortCityPythons.com. To see us in person, the next place we will be is at the New Orleans Herp Show next month, less than a month. If you know me, I'm from New Orleans, so I'm beyond excited that it lined up that we're going to be in New Orleans for this show. Also, Sean Gray pretty much has the best shows next to Tinley, in my opinion. And so I'm excited to finally get to experience one of his shows. And total side note, my best friend's getting married, and that's awesome. And so, yeah, see us in New Orleans. And then after that, we'll be in Syracuse, April 26th, I think.
Somewhere in April. We'll start promoting that show soon, because I'm really looking forward to Steve's show, and it'll be their first show there in Syracuse, and they've already gotten a bigger venue, and it's going to be huge. So we're really excited about that. Thank you guys all for listening to us, as well as thank you, Dillon, for hanging out with us.
Thank you so much for having me. This was an absolute blast, and I enjoyed the 2 hours. Absolutely. It kind of flies, right? It does. So thank you guys all for listening, and we will see you guys all next week.
Woo-hoo. Dillon will still be on with you.
I like how you waited to end the broadcast.